Hello, everyone. It appears I am live. I mentioned something on the Tales of Wonder and Dread page a little while ago that I was going to go live to introduce the brand new book, Lifeblood 2, which was just published today. And that's what I'm here for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book. First off, this is Lifeblood 2. The initial Lifeblood book was published in 2018 with the first batch of 3 books for Tales of Wonder and Dread. So this is the sequel, and none of the stuff in this book appeared in the other book, although some of them have appeared in some other things that we've published. I want to read a little bit from Dan Clefsted's blurb about this, or blurb for the book. He, you might know, is the author of the awesome vampire book, Fiona's Guardians. Here's his blurb. A vampire saves the Beatles. Another convinces ancient tribesmen that he is a god. A human treats a patient who's been bitten and turned. Welcome to Lifeblood 2, more vampire tales. A new collection of fiction and folk histories about exsanguination, sorry, I have trouble with that word, exhumation, transfusion, and trickery. We also travel back to ancient Greece for an origin story about these bloodthirsty nocturnals. The authors in this anthology can't guarantee that crosses and garlic will protect you, but then words will prompt you to think twice. But their words will prompt you to think twice about venturing out at night, or not scattering a suspected revenant's ashes. So yeah, that's Dan's blurb for the book, which kind of does a really good job, and I want to thank Dan for that. Thank you very much, Dan. So I talk a little bit in the introduction about how I first got involved with vampires. I've got a fascination with vampires. I was one of the generation of kids who grew up going to school and hurrying home to watch Dark Shadows, and I fell in love with Barnabas Collins, and that was sort of my whole introduction to vampires. And from there, it was Kolchak the Night Stalker, and everything vampire was great for me. So vampires have sort of a special place in my heart. Vampire stories do. So that's enough for that. I'm just going to sort of give you some introduction to the basic stories here. I've got quite a few fiction stories in this, and the first of those is Origin of the Species, which is one that Dan mentioned in his blurb. It's about the origin of vampires, the very first vampire in ancient Sparta, and how they try to fight him and destroy him. And that's sort of my take on how vampires get started. All the different mythologies have different stories behind vampires, so that's just my take on it. All my stories are interconnected in that they are all in the same world, and at some point I'm going to do a book. I'm planning it for in about a year, collecting all my vampire stories together and sort of weaving them into one interconnected tale. But for the time being, they're all individual stories in different places. Then we have A Murder of Convenience by Del Merritt, and I don't want to go into too much detail on that because I might give something away, but it's about a husband who's watching over his wife who's been getting attacked by vampires, by a vampire, but and he brings the family doctor there to help, and there's more to it than that, but that would be giving it away, and I'm not going to do that. Del, you might remember I did a chat with about a week or so ago about his story in Faithmare. So this is another story from him. The next one is my story, No Sugar Plums. Now that appeared in Horrifying Holidays. It's I mentioned Karl Kolchak. This whole story is told from by a reporter who's had the story told to him, and he uses a pseudonym, which is actually a direct nod to Kolchak, because I used Vincent Kolchak for the name that the reporter uses as a pseudonym. But in any event, the story is a Christmas story about a child who finds something under the tree that isn't Santa Claus. And then the next one is one that Dan mentioned again. I Saved the Beatles. That's my story. That's kind of an interesting story, I think. To me, it's a feel-good vampire story, if you can wrap your head around that. I don't even think it's a horror story. It's kind of a fun little tale, but it does feature several vampires in it. But it's not necessarily a horror story by any means. Um, the next one is The Vampire's Haunted House, which is by Bill Camp. Now, that one previously appeared in Spooky Houses. And it's about a boy or a young man who is basically dared to go spend the night at this haunted house rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a vampire, and what winds up happening to him on his fateful night stay. Next, we have Rite of Passage, which is one of mine, which is another one that Dan mentioned in his blurb. It's also appeared in Faithmere, but it's I guess you can't really, given that it's in a vampire story book, it's vampires. So it is the one about the tribesmen who have been convinced to do a religious rite for a god that's actually a vampire. And then it's followed by The Passage, which is one. There are a couple characters in here that are sort of recurring characters, and one of them is featured in this one, making his journey from Europe to the United States, and sort of the things that go wrong with that journey, and how it links up to some famous event, which I'm not going to give away here. But in that character, like I say, you'll find him in a couple of the stories in Lifeblood 2, Lifeblood 1, and he's in several of the stories here. Then we have The Vampire Edna by R.C. Mulhere. That one is, I don't know, it's more of a comedy story about a housewife, a middle-aged housewife who gets turned into a vampire, and how she doesn't quite get the reaction she expects from people around her. Like I say, it's sort of a comedy story. It's a fun story. Then I've got Dragon's End, which again features those same characters. Now, Lifeblood 1 featured a story called Chasing the Dragon, which actually detailed in my mythos how Vlad Tepes got turned into a vampire. And this story is sort of a continuation of that, in that it tells the story of how Vlad was ended as a vampire. Then we get into the nonfiction section, and we start with one of mine, Peter, boy, I'm going to butcher this name, Plagojevich. It's a blueprint for vampire legends, and it's one of the more famous vampire cases. And I sort of talk about what happened and what the real explanation is and that kind of a thing. But his story really is a blueprint for a lot of the vampire legends, in that most of them come from that story, or at least take on a lot of the characteristics of it. Then we've got one from Rick Hale called Blood-Sucking Fiends, The Second Death of Petra Toma, which is another classic old school supposedly true vampire story, and he details quite nicely what that's about. That's followed by Was Elizabeth Bathory a Vampiric Torturer and Murderer? Now, Elizabeth Bathory perhaps is not the typical vampire story. I don't think there were ever any legends about her coming back to life, but what the legend was that she used the blood of young girls to keep herself youthful. I go into some of that legend and some of what's actually behind it, and perhaps the explanation, and why you might want to look beyond the legend, because there were some reasons some other people might have been putting that story out there at the time. But in any event, her legend is pretty much woven into vampiric lore, so it was important to cover it. Then we got one from my friend Mike Korn that he published at his Wormwood Chronicles, Wormwood Files, Vampire Tales. And he sort of goes over several different stories. He mentions Elizabeth Bathory in it, but he goes over several supposedly true vampire stories and where they came from and, what the details behind them were and that kind of thing. Then we get Frederick Ransom, a North American Vampire Frenzy, which is mine. And it's another one that's actually kind of similar to a lot of the other true vampire stories. That's followed by The Strange Tale of the Gorbals Vampire. Now that is kind of an interesting and fun little story about how, which I think, it wasn't listed as such, but I still think it must have been a inspiration for the movie Lost Boys, because it features a legend where a vampire was terrorizing a town and only the children knew about it, and they took up their sticks and whatever and went out at night into the cemetery looking for this vampire. Now, when I say it's a tale of that, it's literally documented. It happened in the 1950s, and the town itself actually takes a point of pride of this story now, because they talk about how these kids were brave enough to go out there and try to hunt down this vampire. And again, go into some details of what happened with the story and what probably was really going on and what it was attributed to at the time and whether or not that's factual. So it's kind of an interesting little tale. I was actually really taken by that one. Then we have another one by Rick Hale, Blood-Sucking Fiends, Vampires of Ireland, and that should kind of give you the exact idea of what he's got. He's going into the vampire legends that were prominent in Ireland. And then we've got another of mine, augusta de la Grange, 20th century vampire, elaborate 21st century hoax, or both. That's kind of an interesting story. It's a supposed vampire who was tracked down in almost an early buddy film kind of thing, where two people who shouldn't get along gathered together to track this vampire down and kill him when the police weren't able to find him. And supposedly the body of the vampire is in a museum, and a heart, what was supposed to be his heart in a box, went up for sale on eBay in the early part of the 21st century. But there are a lot more details to it than that. It's a pretty fascinating story, and it's a lot of fun no matter how you feel about it. And then we have The Highgate Vampires by my lovely wife Diane Hill, and that one talks about some vampire legends in London's Highgate Cemetery, and gives into some detail on that. And then there's Mercy Brown and Annie Dennett, A Tale of Two Victims of Disease and Frenzy. Now, those two are classic examples of the whole consumption being thought of as vampires, and how it can turn a whole town into a frenzy of vampire hunting and thinking there are undead lurking among them. And it has some of the trademark ideas behind that, trademark legends. And then we got my personal, quote, vampire questioning experiences, which details a couple of incidents that I've had in my life where it could easily be interpreted as vampires. I outlined the incidents, one of which happened when I was in high school with my good friend at the time, Ted D'Angelo. And then the other one happened in 2015 with my wife, Diane, and sort of what we saw, and talk a little bit about explanations and all that. And then finally, we close it off with a story called Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. It's a classic vampire story in the public domain. It actually started out as a chapter of his book Dracula, and the editors decided to remove that chapter, and so it was later published as a short story. And so I'm one of my friends who unfortunately just passed away a couple weeks ago, Glenn Tilson, told me about the story, and so I looked it up and decided it would be a great story to include in here, and I'm glad I found room for it. And I'm glad that Glenn told me about it. Rest in peace, my friend. But that's it for Lifeblood 2. That's what you'll find inside the book. And you can pick it up at lulu.com/spotlight/strange sound. Or if you go to GaryHillAuthor.com and go to Tales of Wonder and Dread page and go to our first page of books there, it's right there. You find a link that says Lulu, that'll take you to the paperback. And there's a link that says hardcover, that'll take you obviously to the hardcover. And if you click the Goodreads link, you can read more about the book there. Now, in the coming weeks, I'm hoping to get some, if not all, of the writers included in the book to come and do some live videos with me. So keep your eyes open for those, and have a great day, and hope you enjoyed this little introduction. Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.